Hello, everyone. Today I will be talking to you about Michel Foucault and his preoccupation with power and discipline. Now, we are reading this article not because we're going to be focusing on Foucault, but we're going to be focusing on architectural design. And one thing that Foucault does is he looks at how architectural design and physical space can actually impact our behaviors, and it can encourage certain behaviors, and how those physical spaces can utilize power to control people. A little bit about Foucault is Foucault was a philosopher slash historian, depending on who you read, in the middle and late 20th century. He wrote a lot of interesting things, but he really focused on how society observes power. And one of these, I guess, treatises or things he wrote about was about how society has disciplined and punished its subjects, i.e., us, the common people, over time, and how people in power have tried to stay in power. Okay, so a couple terms to define. First, we have discipline, as we see throughout the reading, and discipline, according to Foucault, is what people in power do to kind of coerce or encourage certain behaviors. They discipline the people who are not in power. They kind of have the people adopt certain norms. And if they adopt these norms, they follow what the power structure wants. And if they follow what the power structure wants, then the people in power stay in power. And so people are disciplined through different types of norms, different things that create norms, in order to make people, as we'll see in the second bolded passage, in order to make us docile subjects. And we'll talk more about the importance of this towards the end. Moreover, you'll see Foucault reference things like sovereignty. And when he talks about sovereignty, he's talking about like an absolute power or a self-ruling government, a government that has an interest in power and maintaining power. And what this government does, again, is it uses discipline and punishment to create docile subjects. Now, for Foucault, in order for him to make his point, he needed evidence. And so he looked at prisons and how punishment had changed over time, how people used to get executed in front of the public square, and how the sovereignty or the people in power, the government at the time, would do this to reinforce their power. But for Foucault, these things over time would be weakened because executions would be botched. People would question certain types of executions. People would root for the people who are getting actually executed. They would cheer for them. And so Foucault saw how the people in power then changed how punishment was administered. And for him, he saw this in the prison. And one thing that he looked at in terms of prisons and found is that normally prisons are first and foremost not houses of confinement, but departments of correction. So instead of people being executed or punished in a very violent way in front of others, they were sent away, right? And since they were sent away, people couldn't really question the punishable methods in the open, but they were just kind of like, oh, the person's being sent away. But also, a prison allowed a physical space and the people in the physical space to correct the behavior of the bad individuals. Since the people in power are trying to normalize behavior and trying to make us individuals subject to their power, they need to correct our behavior. And one of these ways is through departments of correction, as we call prisons sometimes. And Foucault, I'm going to the second page briefly, found a prison designed by a man named Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century, early 19th century, called the Panopticon. And the Panopticon was, if you will, an ideal prison that ensured the powers that be would be able to normalize behaviors. It was quite interesting, and it's something that we'll be focusing on. Now, to read a little passage about the Panopticon, it says the design of the Panopticon was simple. A circle of cells radiate outward from a central guard tower. Each cell is positioned facing the tower and lit by a large window from the rear, so that anyone inside the tower could see right through the cell in order to easily apprehend the activities of the prisoner therein. The guard tower is eminently visible to the prisoners, but because of carefully constructed blind windows, the prisoners cannot see back into the tower to know if they are being watched. This is a design of ceaseless surveillance. So picture a circular prison, but in the middle of that circular prison, you have this tower. Now in the tower there are windows, but the windows you cannot see inside the windows, you can only see outside of the windows. So the people in the middle guard tower can see all the prisoners in the circle, whereas all the prisoners in the circle cannot see the people in the guard tower. And for Foucault and for Bentham, this is the maximizing of power for the sovereignty or for the people in power. And what the Panopticon does by nature is encourage certain behaviors. If you're a prisoner, what happens is that you are thinking that you're always constantly being watched by the person inside the middle tower or the guards. And so what happens is since you always feel like you're being watched per se, you engage in good behaviors, and you engage in monitoring how other people are acting. Okay? Now it doesn't matter if there's an actual guard in the central tower or not. What matters is there's a physical structure in place that makes people think they're always being watched. And by people always feeling like they're being watched, then what happens is that they always kind of self-regulate their behavior. And for Foucault, this is one of the important elements. Is not only is he saying that people in power try to kind of discipline us, but they try to create things or systems or panopticons, if you will, that then make us regulate our own behavior. Another example would be a security camera. Whether the security camera is on or not, it doesn't matter. The fact that it's there, we are conscious that the security camera is there. So if we walk by one, we regulate our own behavior. And by us regulating our own behavior, we're doing what the powerful entity in society wants us to do. And then we regulate other people's behaviors, and we tell them what they should do, what they should not do. And so what happens is over time, the discipline through the physical design of an actual space, a security camera, a prison, etc., what happens is that these things act as physical things that encourage certain behaviors. We also see this represented when Foucault asks in the passage here, when he asks, is it surprising that prisons resemble factories, schools, barracks, hospitals, and these all resemble prisons? So for Foucault, not only was a prison a place where our behavior was corrected or encouraged, but businesses or factories, if you want to go back to the early 20th century, when we go to school, when we're in hospitals, if we're in military barracks, all of these things are designed in such a way as to encourage certain behaviors. Think, for example, when you're in school and all the desks face the teacher, and the teacher is higher in terms of literal height above the students. And if that teacher walks out of the classroom, the students still stay in their seats and they still face the front, thereby always reinforcing the power structure in the classroom. Moreover, if a student behaves misbehaves when the teacher is gone, the teacher comes back in, chances are another student in the class will actually tell on the other student who misbehaved. And this is a way in which a school can regulate its own behavior. And this is just one example of many. For Foucault, this is major. He is showing how an actual physical space can reinforce a certain behavior on a person. And this is the way in which we are going to be moving with our topic about architecture and design. So 2 things I want to mention here in terms of importance. The one is the last bolded part, and this makes us try to be aware of why it's important to kind of learn about power and how power is normalized and how people are willing to sacrifice their freedoms in order to kind of adopt other social norms. Foucault believed that if the only form of power we are willing to recognize is a sovereign violence, we are in a poor position to understand the stakes of power today. So power is no longer outwardly demonstrated. No, people aren't really being executed as much anymore. There aren't people being dragged out to the gallows to be hung. But instead, power is more subtle today. It's more minuscule, but it still exists. And we are still subject to the forms of power that are pushing against us. And Foucault says that if we're unable to see power in its other forms, we become impotent to resist all the other ways in which power brings itself to bear in forming us. It's very important that when we go out into the world as human beings, Foucault would believe, that we are aware of how the many systems of power that surround us are trying to give us very subtle pushes. And these subtle pushes add up and they normalize our behavior and they make us become very docile subjects who do not question the many things that surround and exist in our world. Right? And it's not just one pressure that's being pushed on us, it's many pressures, and we get certain pressures here and there, and these pressures build up, and we kind of then we have a behavior that we kind of regulate ourselves. Now, how does this relate to where we're going with our class and our second essay assignment? Well, we are focusing on architecture and design. Specifically, if you go to a market, or if you go to Target, or if you are in a school, or if you go in an actual physical space, and what that physical space does with its power, and how it encourages certain behaviors. As you'll see when you read an article titled The Gruen Effect, right? Certain ways that markets and grocery stores and Targets, etc., are structured, they have little subtle messages of saying, do this, do this, do this. And these messages build up and they encourage us to engage in behaviors that we may not want to encourage in. Okay? And that's just one example, many, of how architectural design of space can influence a certain behavior that we have. A chair invites us to sit down in it. A desk in a classroom encourages us to give the power to the teacher and listen to the teacher as if the teacher is the voice of God. Right? Doors act as barriers. They let people in, they separate people, and physical, actual spaces and arrangement of items, they discipline us, and they encourage us to succumb and engage in forms of power that Foucault alluded to. And this is the direction that our reading about Foucault is taking us.